before we keep it moving, as always, how are you guys doing? It's getting really bad here in New York. That isn't all media hype. How are you guys?
Getting by. Spending a lot of time cooking. Very lucky. I've spent years, sort of mastering good Southern food. So making a lot of cornbread and beans and getting by.
Nice. I'll see you later for it.
Yeah, it's
I'll
funny.
break quarantine to get that food.
It's funny how much like food seems to be like routines around food. Basically, like oatmeal now. I'm making some burgers every couple of days. It's and like making tea, which is strange. I feel like I'm back in London.
Tea.
Yeah, exactly. Like tea's become mainly because of my girlfriend. So like I don't know. I'm holding up, thankful at least so far. And I think we have some scary days ahead. So just kind of bracing for that.
Hmm.
Yeah. Word. All right, folks. Well, let's talk about the blame game and the geostrategic fallout of this all. Just yesterday or the day before, Hungary under Viktor Orban has essentially officially ended democracy in Hungary. Emergency powers were passed through parliament, suspending elections, calling for years-long prison sentences for spreading "quote unquote" fake news, a curfew, and other measures, essentially functionally making Viktor Orban a dictator. Bill Barr, the head of the DOJ, has put forward a terrifying request to Congress, allowing judges to hold people indefinitely without trial because of "quote unquote" emergency situations. We'll talk about that more later. And the question that I have for all of you is this all China's fault? Now, if you might be forgiven for saying yes, because here are some headlines that you would have seen in the past couple of months about China. How the coronaviruses revealed authoritarianism's fatal flaw. How Russia is using authoritarian tech to curb the coronavirus. Of course, Russia is always a big target in the United States. And dictatorships are making the outbreak worse. Now, has any of the recent moves in the West, including an adoption of policies that seem to be sensible in this moment, like quarantines that were initially sort of Sinoized as being kind of part of Asia's intrinsic repression and now are universally accepted? Have we rethought that? Or have we said, wow, there is an authoritarian tendency here that's manifesting globally. Maybe we should critique that? No, of course not. The Washington Post, the New York Times, Vox, and so on have continued with brutal attacks on the Chinese government, especially, and the Russian government as well. Now, there's nothing wrong with criticizing any government. And I actually think a really smart and interesting conversation about China is still yet to be had, one that balances the positives, negatives, and just changing global reality, which we'll get to in a minute. But what do we always see in the United States? A outsourcing, an external blame when America's absolutely grotesque imperial rot is revealed every second. Every time an ambulance goes by in New York, and I think about a preventable death that can be laid at the feet of our capitalism, our corporations, Donald Trump, Andrew Cuomo, and Bill de Blasio, I get absolutely disgusted and enraged, and I don't think of ways to blame China. Now, obviously, China sees incredible opportunity in this because the United States and the Europeans are failing. Of course, most spectacularly, the United States. China has, after some significant initial mistakes out of the gate, actually objectively done an incredible job in containing the virus. They are making enormous strides and gains. New reports talking about supposedly underreporting numbers seem to me more likely the effort of kind of countering China's success than any real systemic critique or flaws or new reporting. Now, China, of course, is going to pursue its own foreign policy as anybody else would in this moment. It's sending equipment and doctors and ventilators to Italy, to Serbia, to Hungary, and of course, also in Latin America and the Middle East. The Western alliance system is freaking out and whining because your leaders like the countries like the Serbians are taking China's help instead of course, looking as an example at EU directives that have called for governments inside the European Union to cut health spending literally hundreds of times. And of course, the United States, with its absolutely unparalleled record of obscene inequality and no social safety net, is what is exposing the weaknesses of the Western system and the enormous and obvious opportunities for China. For years now, the liberal mindset and the foreign policy apparatus of the United States has attempted to blame all social and economic ills on Russia and China. Now we have a never-ending grotesque administration whose greed and capitalist double-dealing knows absolutely no bounds. And even as people decry that administration and the death toll rises, they are still looking to blame China. Here's Mike Pompeo, the grotesque Secretary of State, talking about the United States having unique sympathy and care in the world, even as the United States continues to implement punishing grotesque sanctions around the world, and China daily wins a PR battle by sending needed equipment across the world.
A humanitarian challenge, a humanitarian crisis, and we are deeply committed to ensuring that humanitarian assistance gets to the people of those countries. We care more often about the people in those countries than their own leaders do. That's sad. That's a reflection of those regimes too often. It's the reason, in fact, that we're working to help those people raise up in their country so that they can get a better outcome for themselves. I have to reiterate, the goods that are needed for each of these countries to resolve the coronavirus problem in their nations are not sanctioned. They were not sanctioned, they are not sanctioned, and they will not be sanctioned. Indeed, the United States has gone beyond that. It's not just that they're not sanctioned. It's not simply that they're prohibited. The United States, the American people, are working diligently in each of these countries that you're thinking of as sanctioned nations to try and assist getting humanitarian assistance into those countries, not only from the United States, but to help other countries deliver that humanitarian assistance to the people of those nations. This policy is deeply consistent with the finest traditions of the United States of America.
That's, of course, totally dishonest, and Mike Pompeo is sort of like a perfect embodiment of the just absolute grotesque rot. Even if you don't specifically sanction medical goods, as an example, if you make financial transactions impossible for the Iranians and basic import exports, that will apply to medical needs, as it already has. In fact, you saw in Iran, even before the outbreak of the pandemic, folks dying because of lack of access to cancer medication. Meanwhile, China, as I say, has built its own distinct narrative. You can like it or not, but China is going to have an alternative explanation of the world as to where the virus has come from, and it is aggressively and successfully advocating for itself and putting forward help across the world, including in key U.S. and strategic allies like Italy, where the Chinese and, of course, the noble Cuban doctors have done much more than the United States. I'll quote briefly from Ajit Singh now. China, led by its robust state institutions, have contained the virus with decisive measures and have emerged as a global leader in providing medical aid and expertise in countries around the world. Meanwhile, having squandered months to prepare, bought by China's disciplined approach, the U.S. government's response to the pandemic has been wholly inadequate. Relying on the whims of the private sector, the quote-unquote free market, the U.S. is now suffering from the worst corona outbreak in the world, with infections per capita 6 times greater than China. Now, again, should this lead to a romantic narrative about China as an alternative? No. We need to look at all realities. But the fundamental reality and truth of this situation is that China is infinitely outperforming the United States and speeding up a process of global realignment that was already going to happen, probably several years forward, thinking 2020 instead of 2030. The world is looking to China for relief, and the U.S. Has only been able to push itself into greater embarrassment and isolation. With the crisis ongoing and the structural weakness and inability of the U.S. system to provide even basic medical and essential services for itself, the global viewpoint will turn increasingly to China across every corner of the world and will correlate with China's Belt and Road initiatives that will link Africa through Central Asia to Southern Europe. The core of the United States is an absolute rot. It's a disgusting system headed by disgusting and feckless people causing massive unnecessary death. There's no doubt that there's elements of the American tradition that need to be retrieved and defended, just like every single tradition in the world has elements that need to be retrieved and defended. But there's no use in denying the absolute rot of America as it is now, and what is causing not only the great humanitarian devastation of the states, but also speeding up a process of global change that was already underway. Do you guys have anything you want to add to that?
I mean, I would just add that it's very obvious to anyone who's paying attention that China is completely outmaneuvering the United States. Our response has been a great example of just the fact that this empire is very much in decline. And the kind of whining that we're seeing, the kind of like jingoistic whining that we're seeing from people in magazines like Foreign Policy, and basically complaining that China providing medical aid to Italians or Serbians or to the Netherlands is all propaganda. It's like, yes, well, obviously they're doing that to pursue their own interests, but they're also providing necessary medical materials to people.
Well, the answer to that is do your own propaganda.
Yeah, doing good things. Yeah. Doing good things has propaganda value.
Yeah. It's the same thing with Cuba, though, too, right? It's like Cuba is like, oh, Cuba uses their doctors for propaganda. It's like, well, if their propaganda is showing that they're good people and they help people in times of crisis, then at a certain point, like, when does it start being propaganda and start being reality? So I don't know. I mean, I just think that after we see what's just going on economically in the West, China is very much like well positioned to have accelerated the kind of economic conflict between the United States and China that has been, sort of in the cards for a long time, and it looks like they might win it.
I didn't actually retain anything from it. I can't remember the Post-American World by what's his name? The CNN guy, Fareed Zakaria. I remember this like from my era of when you subscribed to The Economist because you thought it would help you be smart. Right. But like it's pretty, I think, surreal to look back at like what that actually looks like as opposed to what all the theories were. Anyway, it's.
Do you remember what you said to me when you first you said I subscribe to The Economist because I'm smart?
Yeah, I was smart. Me and my smart friends discussing The Economist.
I read the Fareed Zakaria because I'm smart.
Did you guys?
Look, I think it's a really. There was a piece in the Financial Times I tweeted out the other day about China's building essentially an alternative to the internet. An alternative internet. And again, in terms of objective reality, shows like this would not do well in that model of the internet, right? So again, I can't substitute one romantic narrative with another, but it's very important to both then take it to the United States. Platform capitalism, Silicon Valley, built in partnership with the U.S. intelligence services and military industrial complex, has created an internet here that is more open in some respects, but profoundly undemocratic and monopolized. Mm-hmm. So what is there a possibility of a third way for an internet that does not exist? And then the other part is the reality of, there's very little alternative in the world right now, right? And China is objectively performing better. So that's the other just sort of major takeaway, like being able to assemble and build this many hospitals, contain an outbreak, get praised by the WHO, and then effectively nation brand by putting stuff across the world. That's a win. And the constant whining about it just doesn't achieve anything, even if you were concerned about the balance of power and this and that. It just makes you look totally ineffective and embarrassing.
And I just wanted to add something that came to my head is an interview with Yanis Varoufakis, and this was probably from a couple of years ago, but somebody basically asked him about, the rise of China and whether or not that's like a great threat to global stability. And he told a story that was really interesting about him negotiating with the European Union. Remember when he was the finance minister of Greece, he was going on this horrible fighting against all this terrible austerity, and basically being told by the European Union, this doesn't make sense, but we're going to do it anyway.
Yep.
Versus negotiating with the Chinese. And he said, the Chinese are very smart investors, and they are playing for the long game. They understand. You look at the loans that they're giving out to people; they're giving them at very low rates. They understand that the world needs massive investment, both through capital and also through manpower, and they're providing it in a way that the United States can come up with all these stories about why the Chinese competition is somehow wrong. And they've come up with a million different reasons for it. But the fact is that China's showing up to a world that massively needs a kind of stimulus. And hopefully that would come from a source that doesn't have the issues that we have in China. And it's not a kind of blind praising of that system, but it's a recognition that the United States is very much an empire in decline and cannot get anything other than short-term goals outside of their head, while the Chinese are very happy to play a decades-long game.
That's also another thing that's interesting when you dip into more China studies, like in contrast to these very one-dimensional narratives. And again, I'll keep reiterating, of course there's repression. Of course, we can't deny things that are true. And at the same time, people who work in partnership with China is around things like Belt and Road will always strongly emphasize how much more flexible China is to work with on those types of projects in terms of adaptability and responding to local circumstances versus the kind of US one size fits all model. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.